So last class, I would say last 2 weeks, our first class, we kind of touched on this side of things around the introduction of cybersecurity governance, risk and compliance, and all of that. We deep dive into governance actually, and then also discussed the next step will involve, at least from the ISACA approach, will be to kind of go into how do we identify risk in itself before we even start managing risk, right? We first need to be able to identify, understand what is risk as it relates to our businesses and things like that, including then getting into assessing the risk and responding to the risks, as well as monitoring. So today's class, because the new book kind of restructured things a little bit, but it's basically the same content as I keep saying. They changed the title to like governance and risk identification. So we're just going to call it that, but it's basically going to focus on how do we identify risk. So a high level recap from the first class, as I mentioned, we touched upon what is governance as it relates to cybersecurity. And I believe one of our discussions for the week kind of went straight to that governance aspect, right? Which later on, I'm actually looking forward to our kind of catch-up sessions that we do, the discussions to see there were really great responses on that discussion around the executive order signed by the president. But that's part of governance, right? Setting the tone. Even though it's not coming from a for-profit organization, it's more of a nation state, but it's still around defining the principles that kind of involve the how the country is trying to approach cybersecurity and all of those kind of things, right? Including identifying the risk as well as getting into further down the line will involve how do we manage it. So the second part we discussed in depth as well around risk management, right? What is risk management? So after that governance, setting the tone and everything, we now have to begin looking at how do we manage the risk. Then we get into the compliance, which could be also seen as that monitoring aspect. So the governance, the tone has been set. We have a process to follow, be it a framework or whatever around the risk management. Now ensuring that we are continuously following that process is part of the compliance, right? So today, however, what we will get into at a high level, I have an agenda here. It's around completely risk identification. But before we even identify risk, let's define it, right? So we'll talk about what is risk capacity, appetite, tolerance, certain risk culture, and how do you communicate it, right? What are the elements of risk? Like what and what needs to be in place for a risk to actually be present? You can call it the risk recipe for. But then after defining the risk, what is an organizational strategy? There has to be one, right? Each single organization must have its own strategy and how it wants to approach risk depending on its business objectives, right? Then what are the area of concerns, especially within IT? It always depends on the field. Within IT, we'll look at what are the areas of concerns. Maybe within the medical sector is completely different. So we'll at least look at things from a different perspective. Then we get into what are the different methodologies we can apply to actually identify risk in itself, right? There's no one way of doing things. Like you cannot take a methodology of identifying risk that is used in a for-profit organization or maybe a private institution and apply it maybe to a public institution. It might not necessarily be the same, especially if their business objectives differs, right? What is risk to one business could be an opportunity to another. We'll talk about how you come up with risk scenarios. Like with everything around risk, you don't necessarily begin to assess risk without creating scenarios. And scenarios are those what if, as well as you kind of come up with situations that might arise and what could be the impact. All of those will kind of discuss how you come up with risk scenarios. Then we will talk about ownership, accountability, and responsibility. As it relates to risk, one thing to identify risk, it's another to ensure that somebody owns that risk. Initially, I was going to say responding to it, but I will go with managing it, right? You can identify, as an organization can identify a risk, but if there is no entity or person that has been assigned to respond or manage that risk, then truly there is no action towards the risk. I guess that's why we'll start saying, that's why sometimes the CISO's job can be a hard one, not because the day-to-day task in itself is difficult, but rather you are continuously under a fire drill, right? Continuously being proactive to make sure identifying to make sure it doesn't happen. Because approaching cybersecurity or any kind of risk management from a reactive approach, it's usually frowned upon. You don't want your house to burn first before you start thinking of how to handle things. Um, IT risk registers, we'll touch upon that, but has a lot of names across the board. The US government calls it POAM. ISACA calls it IT risk register, but overall, we are going to talk about the importance of documentation, and then we'll get into that risk awareness side of things, right? How you have now finished identifying it. How do you ensure other folks understand it? Now, before we deep dive into risk identification, I want to quickly refresh our memory on the importance of understanding business objectives, right? We've been talking about that. Every single thing we basically do as it relates to risk management, cybersecurity risk management, at least in the modern times today, is to complement the business, right? Compliance in itself is not meant to restrict the business from operating, rather, it's meant to complement the business. And we discussed that kind of mindset shift. It's a huge thing these days. Our ability to really position risk management from to be an enabler of a business, it what's gives um, cybersecurity a seat in the boardroom, right? So we will kind of touch a little bit about the importance of whether you're an IT engineer, you prefer your hoodie just with your headphones and just, you know, write on the keyboard, or you're a program manager, you like your suit, like Fortune as I'm seeing here, you like your suit and just having in those meetings, it doesn't matter. So long as one is within an institution, then there is absolutely a need for the person to understand the business strategy as well as the objective. At the very little, they should understand it as it relates to their work, right? If one is within the IT shop, then they absolutely need to understand how the IT shop is meant to complement the entire business. So, starting with the first thing around basically risk management, as I keep saying, is understanding the business strategy and objectives. Like, what is the strategy of the organization? You can look at it from, is it cost leadership, client service, stability? Actually, an example of stability will be if someone is asking me what is the mission, even though there is a mission statement, but what is the mission of maybe US national security or whatsoever? It's truly around ensuring stability, right? Not necessarily client service. Maybe the citizens are the clients, but there is that ensuring stability within the nation. That in itself is not necessarily for profit, but it's a mission, right? Um, growth, growth could be from revenue, could be from individuals, could be from user base. It doesn't matter, right? Acquisition. I'm not trying to advocate for monopoly here, but it could be a business strategy, right? We're even seeing it a lot. A lot of people are starting starting startups, I guess. Yeah, a lot of people have startups, and the ultimate objective is to get acquired by a bigger organization, not necessarily to grow and be the next big thing. Some people do that. Others really just want to maintain a very small shop of no more than 5 people, no matter how much money you throw at them. So imagine going into an organization that is for profit and really doing things with an expectation of, we want to get a $1 billion market cap. And probably the founders of those organizations, that's not their key objective. Maybe they just want to maintain 5 users and do their own little thing without the money. So, it's always important to see and understand and align with those kind of strategy as well as the objectives. Doing so will allow cyber risk management to complement the overall objectives. Okay, so switching to risk identification. We mentioned we're going to take the ISACA approach, and today we are going to deep dive into the risk identification. I didn't mention it before class, but so my goal for today, I guess my own objective for today is to kind of go through this. It's something you can pick up. Truly, you can pick the book, read it on your own, and also understand it. But at the same time, we'll just kind of go over it at a high level, take a break, and then come back and have those conversations. There are a lot of folks in the class that can share a lot about how they handle these things on a day-to-day basis, and then we'll also deep dive on that governance side of things from the discussions. So getting into risk capacity, appetite, and tolerance. So what is this? What is risk capacity? I know there is a definition here, but does anybody want to volunteer and kind of explain, say 15 seconds, what exactly is risk capacity beyond the dictionary definition we're seeing? What's your understanding of that? Anybody? No? Okay. Um, appetite. You know what? I'm just gonna move on. Seems like anyway. So risk capacity, right, as the definition says, involves truly what an enterprise or organization can tolerate, right, without its existence coming into equation. So basically, a kind of a stress test. How much can the organization really take without it impacting its overall objectives? That's that risk capacity. And I tend to see it more around how much, if we have to put it in a monetary value, right? How much is the organization willing to, can everybody please go on mute? If we have to put it on a monetary value from a financial perspective, it will be more on how much is the organization willing to bet or willing to lose without necessarily, getting into trouble from a financial standpoint that it ultimately affects its existence, right? And then there's also that risk appetite. Risk appetite has to do more around, from the word appetite, truly what kind of risk are you willing to take? What kind of risk are you willing to engage within, right? So as an organization, maybe let's use a fintech, right? A financial tech company. A fintech company might decide that, okay, getting into financing is really something we're unwilling to, engage in. We just still want to be a servicer in terms of issuing just debit cards to users and they're able, like something like Cash App. We are unwilling to begin financing or borrowing or lending because chances are the risk is quite high for us at this level. So that kind of decision that allows them to know what they're willing to engage in and not, and setting those boundaries is basically their risk appetite, right? And then tolerance. Tolerance sound a little bit like capacity, but they are different, right? Risk capacity, it's, I wouldn't say from a positive side, but it's more from a willingness. Let me use a human analogy in as this example. So as a human being, what exactly are you willing to engage in? that will not necessarily, you won't lose a sleep over it, right? Maybe you might want to be okay with bungee jumping, and you just do that, come back home, you're fine with it. Do you want to engage in skydiving? Probably not. But if it gets to that, you would engage in it, not because you want to, but it's because no, it's because you have to, and that's around your risk tolerance. Will it affect your health or anything? Probably not, but it's really beyond your risk limits. That's around that risk tolerance, right before it begins to impact you significantly. Um, any questions on this?
Dr. Waziri,
Yeah.
When talking to clients as well, and then they ask about that's why I was a little confused with capacity tolerance from when we were talking about it. But we talk with clients about risk acceptance or risk appetite and risk tolerance. You more or less tell them, if you're driving a car on a highway and it's 65 miles an hour, and if you go 70, maybe that's your appetite. You might want to go 75. That's your tolerance, because you're going to get, if you get caught, you've already accepted that you're going to be 10 miles over. And that's the easiest way for these high levels to understand what appetite and tolerance is. But the capacity one is new. That's a new one. I mean, for me, capacity and appetite are similar, because if you're talking about a healthcare agency, their appetite for risk is very low because of the data that they house. If you're talking to a biomedical company, their risk is pretty high because they take risks every day trying to find cures. So their data is always shared amongst their peers. So it's funny how the capacity and the appetite was, or capacity and tolerance is being defined.
So yes, first, that's a great example, the one with the vehicle around going 65, 70, and 75. I'm gonna steal that one. I might probably not give you any credit because I might not remember, but I'm gonna say it.
No worries.
I'm gonna say it because it's really a good one. But also, all of these can get confusing sometimes. How I tend to differentiate risk capacity and appetite is risk appetite gives you a choice. You get to decide. An organization get to dictate what type of risk environment they would like to engage in. Risk capacity, not necessarily. You find yourself in it, and now you are getting extended. So, given your healthcare, like your health organization example, using that as an example, a health sector might decide their risk appetite truly to not include anything that has to do with I'm trying to think of something, because honestly health is involved in a lot, but maybe a health organization might decide that their risk appetite will not include anything financial sector related. Maybe they might not even issue HSAs because they need to send out debit cards. So they might decide, like, you know what, we're going to outsource that. As such, we are not taking that risk. And that ability to make that decision in terms of what activities they want to engage in and what kind of risk present itself definitely is within the risk appetite. Now, within the risk capacity, I would say if an organization still made a decision, let's say Coca-Cola, for example, they decided that they are in beverages, fine. It's their willingness to go into that. They already decided that, and they are willing to take any risk that is common within beverage industries, right? Fine. But now something happened, there's some form of contamination and whatever, and truly Coca-Cola stock has plummeted and all of that. The level that Coca-Cola can continuously take that risk without going bankrupt or without necessarily impacting their existing operations or even impacting their profit, that is their capacity, like their bucket. So that's sometimes how I tend to approach them. And we will talk about risk acceptance. Risk acceptance is not in the same bucket as capacity, appetite, and tolerance. Risk acceptance tends to come in terms of responding to risk. So you have already made a decision to engage in maybe a sector. Like I said, Coca-Cola, that's a willingness to accept a risk that happens within the beverage industry. And it's usually sometimes in form of how do you respond to risk. There's risk sharing, risk transfer, and all of those. We'll touch on that. But yeah, thanks for that example. I'm definitely gonna take that. All right. Moving on. We will get into, so we've been talking about risk, but truly there is the aspect of risk culture and how do you communicate it. Risk culture, I am talking about how do organizations position themselves when it comes to risk, right? Because it does have an effect on the employees in terms of everything, including how probably the industry that they play within kind of respond to risk. So, high level example, um, one could say the minute you hear of national security or you hear of one of these three-letter agencies, um, the risk starts becoming high, especially like whistleblowing or whatever. It's a huge deal, right? And who set that tone? It's around really the community, like be it IC, be it um, entirely just the NSS community, like how they tend to position and really communicate risk has defined the culture around that. But then also you can look at maybe another industry. Let me see. Could be social media, right? How they tend to also communicate and set the culture for risk could probably have defined the industry to a point where people are just willing to take whatever risk it is, just say whatever they want to say, and probably with no to little repercussions. So those are all around risk culture and communications, and we'll get in depth around that. So risk culture, there are certain elements that makes up risk culture. What are those? We do have the organizational behavior towards risk. What does that mean? It it means how do organizations respond when a risk-related stuff is in play, right? Um, Obviously, with like cybersecurity, we tend to hear the fire drill, like whoa, everything goes crazy. That this has happened. Um, an organization really activate everything. It's just like a fire department. Basically, the incident response gets kicked in. And then we are familiar with like the financial sector also, like hacks and whatever. How the response goes is completely different, especially if it's directly impacting the organization. I'm not praying for it, but imagine Wall Street getting hacked into. The response will be severe, right? Probably the federal government will even engage in, right? Either bailouts, whatsoever. It becomes a big deal. That's organization and industry response towards the risk. But then let's talk about data theft, especially around PII. You hear of Equifax, it keeps making the news and whatever, but there are just lawsuits here and there. You get your $15 probably in the mail, or maybe you get a little bit of, I don't know, credit monitoring for a couple of years or whatsoever, but it's not really as like financial hacks. I'm not saying it's not as important or it is important, but all of these are kind of how either organizations or society responds and their behavior towards such risk and how it basically impacts it. So then you begin to see, if Equifax happened, and you weigh it, and probably the cost of responding to what happened with Equifax really is lesser than the proactive measures, then probably it's okay for them to still be like that. And even the next organization, once they do the cost benefit analysis, they realize we probably don't need to do any implementation. If the worst happens, this is just what's going to cost us, right? So all of those are behaviors towards risk. Um, some are risk averse, some are risk taking. One organization or one sector that we know is always risk averse, especially to a lot of things. It's the national security. Why? Because it has significant impact, right? Could even threaten human lives. It could a lot of things, especially if it impacts the stability of a nation state. That is just a no go. And this is why sometimes when people say the government is left behind technology wise, I'm like, not really, not really. Uh, the government cannot necessarily consume technology at the same rate as the public space because the risk is higher. You can't compare um, an intelligence organizations that really a single mistake could significantly result in human lives and all of that. You can't expect them to just continuously embrace technology that have not been tested and proven to work at the same rate as some random, I don't know, I'm even thinking of social media company, for example, right? You can expect the IC to move as fast as Facebook because truly, if Facebook were to get hacked, how many people are gonna die? No, so it kind of makes sense for the IC to be conservative in their approach and for Facebook to be risk taking. And we all know the higher risk you take, the more advancement you make, but also the burn could be higher. So yeah, the acceleration in adoption of technology is not necessarily due to government's inability, but it could be based on risk analysis. So another significant thing around risk culture within organization is the organization's behavior towards negative outcome. It has a pro and con, but mostly the con side of things, especially in this day and age. Organizations that are not open and willing to embrace mistakes from especially say employees will find themselves in actually a much more difficult situation than those that are willing to embrace that employees can make mistakes. So in terms of that risk organizational risk culture, you start to realize if an organization tends to position itself as an organization that maybe is, you know, harsh towards assuming a mistake towards risk and whatever, especially if it relates to employees, then it's completely different. But then there are also instances where you find it probably makes sense, especially due to the repercussions. Again, these are things I tend to see from public like from the industry side of things as well as the government, because that's really one, I wouldn't say black or white, but it's really two different institutions that handle risk completely different, right? So some have a learning culture and some have a blaming culture. Definitely the blaming culture is frowned upon, but to others it also serves as a way of, making an example, assuming from a mistake, where who is responsible or who is accountable for what went wrong and they need to be taught a lesson. So it depends, right? Now, behavior towards policy and compliance. So we're all familiar with policy and compliance. Policy could operate within the governance as well as risk management, but we're all conversant that compliance is something that really complements and enforces risk management, right? So how do organizations behave towards that? Some organizations have a written rule in place and policies, and it's very clear on what it is. And doing so will allow people to actually be clear and ensure that they abide by it. And others just, don't really, they're just going with the flow, hyper flexible. So, an example is an organization could say, hey, we discourage Employees using their personal devices for work-related stuff. We discourage quite big. There is even no enforcement. There is no policy in place. There is nothing, probably just a sign or people just saying it. Okay, but what does that mean? And others will actually go ahead and have controls in place such that if you bypass those controls, significantly uh, it could significantly affect you from probably termination of a job, lawsuit, you name it, right? So all of these matter from an organizational standpoint. So as a CISO, how do you balance all of this? Because I would say, depending on the organization, but a CISO has a lot of influence in certain organizational risk culture, right? Including how they communicate such culture. For a lot of us, we definitely know that the job is much more of a soft skill job than it is a technical competence. So, how you talk to folks, do you set the environment where people, if they really see something, they identify a risk, they feel comfortable to come and actually say it, even if it means it's um, someone above them doing it. All of those, right? So, as a CISO, how do we approach all of these? They matter. And these are some of the basics we look at before even getting to identifying what's a risk, right? And all of these are part of that elements of risk. Okay. So again, continuing especially on the communication side of things, and now getting more into so what does an effective IT risk communication involves, right? Earlier, before the start of this class, someone, I can't remember who was it exactly, but someone asked, what are the requirements for the risk strategy paper as well as the project? That is the need for me to communicate, right? And they are trying to respond or mitigate a risk that might happen eventually if I don't, because without me setting it, the requirements and the expectations, then it's open to interpretation unless they have the capacity or capability of reading the human mind. I'm not saying they don't, but unless they have that, then it's open to multiple interpretations. So there has to be an effective risk communication from certain expectations. How do we set that? The, from organization wide, the strategy, the objectives, the goals, those are all part of effective communication. As it drills down to the policy maybe around those who are accountable. Now you're getting into executioners, right? IT shops and all. So they need procedure. And then you want to enlighten the entire organization from awareness and all of those. But then also, how do you capture that? We mentioned the risk strategy paper. I kind of mentioned what was asked of me earlier. But still, given that rubric without really putting some form of status or defining or having a profile where this is the requirement. If you get it at this point, this is well, this is good. That's very subjective actually. This is 5, this is 4, this is 3, and this is unacceptable, right? Now going back all the way to the first slide, we discussed around setting those risk tolerance and capacity and things like that. We have to do that. All of those come together to form the risk profile, right? What are those KRIs? We have to have a metrics of measurement around risk as well. Then we get into the capability. So just because you're a CISO doesn't mean you push for things. You have to look at it. Are we capable of doing it? If we are to adopt this risk management approach, would we be able to maintain it? Right? And this is a part where truly it's also a huge soft one. We are human beings, and egos sometimes play a role, so we like to chew more than we can. Fortunately for the CISO, it's not a good one to chew more than your own what you can actually swallow. So the truth is, sometimes that capability, organizational capability, there is a huge need for a CISO to take themselves out of the picture, or even the competence of their teams alone, to look at it from the org wide. Is this enforceable? Is this manageable? Is this really gonna work? Do we have the budget? And one cannot even look at it from, let's use maybe let's give an example of risk management from applying controls, right? We all know that deploying controls, that's not the last step. We have to continuously monitor them. So yeah, we might be able to deploy it. We have the best engineers, but do you have the team capable of monitoring? Do you have the team capable of responding? All of those are things that need to be looked into by a CISO before making risk decisions. Now, if they are not honest with themselves or are unable to look at those ranges, then you find they have engaged in it, but it's halfway done. Um, Maybe the company wants to switch from Gmail to Outlook, just as an example. The CISO only looked at it from existing capabilities without the need, like without understanding that, well, it's two different platforms. Do we have the competence and do we have the capability, as well as the folks who are able to manage Outlook from admin standpoint? And just went ahead and make the transition. Now we have former Gmail folks, former Gmail admins who needs to ramp up on Outlook admin, but they are not fully ramped up, and now there is a need for some couple of escalations or things are done or some response. So what do you start doing? That might end up becoming a good thing for someone with an Outlook admin trying to get into that company, because immediately you might see an opening, right? So all of those are kind of decision making from the CISO that tends to happen. Maybe the company operates within G charts, but they all went ahead and bought Apple devices, maybe not Chromebooks, and Apple is in the middle of a fight with Google and decided to kick out the is it Google Meet of the marketplace. Now, good luck. How is that going to happen? Well, I guess there is the browser, but all of these are challenges and things that a CISO should really stay ahead of the curve to be thinking. All right. So next, what are the elements of risk? What needs to come into the picture to actually become a risk, right? I believe some of us are familiar with words like vulnerabilities, likelihood and impact, assets, and all of those risk factors and whatever. So you can have a vulnerability and the likelihood of a vulnerability getting exploited, but if there is no impact, then probably there is no risk, right? Um, you could have two of these without maybe, I mean, vulnerabilities always exist. Um, but if the likelihood of something happening is, very minuscule, then probably there is no risk. I always give an example of everybody say Cali or Florida is going to sink, but when is it going to sink? What's the likelihood? The vulnerability exists. Okay, we hear that. But the impact is going to be a lot, significant, right? We know that if it were to happen, but what's the likelihood of it happening anytime soon? Probably not in our lifetime. So there's no risk for the foreseeable future. Um, so the importance I will stress here is around vulnerability doesn't mean a weakness. And that's where, again, engineers tend to get pissed and devs, because to a lot of engineers, they can like seeing a vulnerability instantly means there is a risk. Actually, not. A cupcake business, I give this example all the time, but a cupcake business that only has informational page and they don't have any certificate, so there's no HTTPS, so there's no TLS certificate. but there's really nothing on the page that the vulnerability exists. Yeah, they're using port 80, not 443. Absolutely. Um, is there a likelihood of that getting exploited? Yes, someone might probably, even change the page content. But what's the impact? Maybe nothing. No, for all the care, the site can even go down forever and nobody will even notice it. So the impact is nothing, or rather minimal. As such, risk doesn't exist. A typical engineer, and I use the word typical, not in a negative connotation, but I used to be an engineer. An engineer without understanding of the boardroom will see our page with no TLS certificate, and that's it. Like, whoa, 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 this needs to be addressed. Actually, no, it doesn't. Probably it has no impact or it's very minimal. As such, putting the resources towards that might not necessarily be beneficial. So, again, there could be a vulnerability and an impact without likelihood. As I mentioned, the one Cali, Florida, sinking, and all of that. But now with Cupcake, we see that there is a vulnerability and there is a likelihood, but no impact. So there's no risk. Vulnerabilities is a vulnerability is a tough one. Hardly for one to say there's no vulnerability because truly vulnerability is like something that always exists, similar to a risk in itself. You just reduce vulnerability, right? Because I'm trying to see if there's anything I can come up that doesn't have a vulnerability, but the truth is everything has a vulnerability. If the art vanishes in itself, that's a vulnerability to everything, right? Uh, so yeah, so risk factors. It's also important to understand as we evaluate risk, and these are nuances, right? These are nuances from, I wouldn't say defining risk, but scaling as well as understanding if the risk is even, if it's worthy of paying attention to from the factor that it is related to. So same example, there is no TLS certificate. Where is the page? Where is the website? Probably it's just an internal page that nobody cares about. It's just within an intranet that is behind so maybe who knows? It's not even on TCP/IP. Maybe it's on Link 16. Who cares, right? Maybe it's on SIPRnet or Nipper or one of these places where within that anybody within that community, it's fine for them to say it. So then you begin to realize like, okay, the vulnerability exists, the likelihood exists. There's also a certain impact, but due to the risk factor, it's not from an external context. It is with internal context, and it's kind of like fine. Then you begin to realize like, okay, you're willing to either accept it or it becomes insignificant. So all of those are a couple of examples. It's like you coming home and dropping your wallet on the kitchen counter. All right. Could someone steal it? Yeah, probably. Um, let's use a campus, right? Maybe dorm room. So many folks. But come in, leave your wallet on the counter, and could someone take it? Yeah. Will it be from someone from external? External? Probably no. Will it be someone within your dorm room? Yeah. Do you really care? Maybe not, because you only have your student ID, and the only thing you care about is your ID number. But every student probably might go look up your ID number. So if that's the only then probably you really don't care. However, you don't want an external entity having your ID number because probably it's what you use to get into the bus. So that's evaluating the risk because the vulnerability, likelihood, and impact does exist, but from which factor? And that will be a decision driver. Assets, I didn't touch about them because everybody honestly knows them. Organizational assets, they differ. Assets just around the thing, just what is valuable, right? The valuables themselves are the assets. So let's touch on that, the risk strategy of the business. How do risk strategy of businesses around organizations, right? So related to IT. Now I'm talking about from an organization standpoint. what are a couple of risk types relating to IT? We're not talking about like access and security, availability, infrastructure, all of these, fancy word. But then there are also like project ownership. We mentioned earlier on like risk ownership in itself. It is a risk if a risk is identified and there is no owner. So I'm gonna repeat that. Like there is actually a risk if an organization identifies a risk and doesn't assign ownership to it, right? Like nobody owns managing that risk. That in itself is a risk. So that could also be projects. There has to be project ownerships. Uh, if there's any dev here, devs and PM have this relationship, but yeah, PMs do have their own uh, importance and value that they add, especially around owning the project as well as products. Scheduling, all of those things are actually risk related stuff related to business. Another senior management support. We discussed this the first class. While bottom up approach, it's it's okay, but we all know how hard it is for um, junior employees to convince the senior leaderships, right? So we always want that support from the top. And if that doesn't exist, that in itself is a strategy related risk. Um, Alignment with business goals and objectives. So sometimes you find, you know, I will give an example related to work. On many scenarios, you find good employees, really hardworking. They know exactly what they're doing and whatsoever. They keep working, but the promotion is not there. The good bonus is not there. Why is that? Truly. Well, probably they have been working on the wrong thing. They are probably working on what the organization doesn't necessarily care about. They are good, but they're not paying attention to what the organization's objectives are. What are the organization's goals? If the organization wants to land in Mars, well, taking the organization to Pluto doesn't matter. They want to go to Mars. So this is also just from a work perspective. Same thing, risk management must align with the business goals and objectives. While you might be the best security engineer, security manager, security whatsoever, you have a DSC in cyber or PhD in cyber, the most knowledgeable, and all of that, and you're the CISO, there is a difference between doing things right by the book, and by book I don't mean the law, but like from a theoretical standpoint, and there's doing it right in accordance with what the organization expects. The latter is how risk should be handled. I know the class is starting to sound like an MBA class, and it goes hand in hand. Um, Organizational structures. Well, this is slowly changing, but even within flat organizations, there has to be someone that is kind of, there has to be a RACI matrix, right? There has to be responsibility, accountable, consulted, and informed, no matter what. So there has to be some form of delegation or structure around individual. Like, I know startups are a bit different, but even startups that people wear many hats, as they grow, competence and alignment and structures begin to fall in place. And this is debatable. Things are changing, right? And the way organizations are also viewing things are slowly changing depending on the nature of the organization. Obviously, not the military, um, but some of these IT organizations, titles still exist. There are managers, there is the CEO, and all of that, but execution wise, it's impact driven. So you start to see things, the structures are changing a little bit, but there is still some form of, for lack of a better word, a hierarchy, right? Which is around that organizational structures that define the racing. And we already talked about organizational culture, but ethics and behaviors, these are subjective, but they matter a lot. Um, I'm not getting into psychology or philosophy, but let's talk a little bit about ethics, right? Organizational ethics really matter in terms of how the nature of risk. So what do I mean by that? I'll use Google for example. I believe a lot of us have either heard of, you know what, I'm gonna scratch Google. I'm not taking a position here, but I will use the intel sector, for example, the CIA and Edward Snowden, right? It's also an issue of ethics. Kobe Edwards and the CIA's ethics doesn't align, and that presents a risk in itself. Um, Google, for example, including Microsoft, a lot of these big techs, Uber, you hear employees talking and responding to things that's around ethics. I believe Google employees kind of said Google will not engage in JEDI, the US Department of Defense project that was initially kicked in before it got withdrawn, due to ethical issues, right? So all of these then begin to probably present a risk, and that risk will be from either market opportunity, either whistleblowing, like Edward Snowden, either actually disgruntled employees. So all of these matter, right? Organizational behavior. Again, bringing touchy and sensitive topics, but how organization behaves could also mean something, could have a risk. Something could happen if the organization doesn't engage in the society and respond to that in a manner that the society feels it's right. Then it could, especially in this day and age, could be a risk. Or if they do, it could be a risk. So all of these, as funny as it sounds, it's slowly becoming actually the job of the CISO. And one one funny thing is the CISO's role is not cyber only. The title actually is Chief Information Security. Information security is not cyber only, it's also communications. So it's also journalism, it's information. So as a CISO, these will all fall under you. And it's your job to clarify to the board how to handle that. So this is the most basic one. I think everybody knows. Um, why the CISO's job can be hard is they are the law enforcers. Security managers, I think, and compliance folks are lawyers within organizations and legal departments are well known to not be the regular employees' friends, right? So they are not as friendly as the accounting department. They are not as friendly as the IT shop, not as friendly as the product team, and all of that kind of makes sense because they do checks, they enforce things, they push things that are a bit uncomfortable. But ultimately, as a CISO, it tends to all fall within you. Yeah, I agree with you, Vito. The CISO's tenure lasts an average of 1.8 years. I'm not surprised. Honestly, it's even becoming entirely security. So yeah, and too many things go happens, right? That the CISO. So it's a huge decision to decide if one wants to be a CISO or not, especially or rather depending on where it is. Because yeah, it's a constant fire draw. Maybe it will get better, but for now, yeah. Again, any organization, especially big organization that do not have a process in place towards managing risk, yeah, that in itself is a risk. And you mentioned some of those include like at least some common ones. 800-37 is a common risk management approach used by the US Gov. Also, there's also the 27001 and like different frameworks and uh, pretty much policies and approach exist, right? So As an IT person, let's tailor this entire conversation to IT. From a technology standpoint, what are a couple of things you should look into or you should pay attention to as a risk practitioner? You are no longer the CISO, you are just a practitioner. I said just, I guess I'm minimizing the level, but no. As a risk professional, right? Maybe you're a consultant, a security consultant, hired by an organization to look into their IT kind of things, side of things, like their entire information technology stacks and everything within the organization, and kind of identify a couple of risks and let them know where they need improvement. No, they paid you, so you come in, you start looking at things. There is the hardware side of things. What do you look at? So many things. These cannot be defined. There is no checklist for this, right? This is also where experience matters. This is where, um, on the bright side, there are a lot of guidances. Again, I would say one good resource also is the products themselves. If you are to go into an organization, at least from a tangible stuff, there are hardware, softwares, and all of that. Look into them. What Ask the community. Go through their manuals. Go through their websites. Call them for all that matters. Right. Look into the updates, versions, and software versions, and all of those. So hardware components, you will look at all of those. Software, you look at a lot of them from patching to whatsoever. You look at like again, IAAA, like identity, authentication, authorization, and accounting also falls in that, right? Access management go fall under software and applications, right? Operating systems. Oh, the first one is quite good, lack of interoperability, operability, and classic example will be maybe your organization is multi-global. As a multi-global organization, there is the maybe India team and there's a US team. Maybe the India team are all on Android devices. Maybe the entire organization is on Android devices, and the means of communication is by default is, I don't know if there's that, but Android chat, for example. Now all of a sudden decide to get everybody an iPhone. What does that mean? They don't operate, right? There's no interoperation across those things. So iPhones is everything on iMessage. The other one is Android chat. So all of these kind of exist. Maybe the organization brought you in and said, well, we're thinking of updating our employees' devices over here because one of our clients uses Apple products and we're thinking of all switching to Apple products without considering the other sister team that is, say, in India. Those are all things that as a risk professional you will look into. Complexity. There is this thing around, if it's so hard, then it's not necessarily secure, which is true. It doesn't have to be so hard, right? Um, there is that. That's like around, let's use biometrics. The more you increase the sensitivity, the lesser the operational happens, right? Maybe Touch ID, for example, or thumbprint. If you calibrate it such that it's very sensitive and a little dust in your finger is just gonna pick it up and decline, then probably you might have a lot of queue and a lot of folks trying to all ID themselves. So all of those things, complexity doesn't translate to security. It's there. Environmental controls, they are a thing. HVAC, water, I believe everybody knows this. Platform anthropologies, we all know this. Centralized systems, peer-to-peer, and all of those. These are all places where you can look for risk, networking components, and so many other places. So we kind of discussed already how you can define risk, right? Where to look for, as well as what needs to come together to make up a risk. But how do you truly identify a risk? Well, a couple of methods. You first define your assets. We all know what are assets, the valuables, right? And then what are the threats? We discussed that. Are there existing controls? So what do we mean by existing controls? Existing controls means certain controls that are already in place, right? So if you buy a door today, it comes with a default lock, probably just a smaller one. That's a control in itself? Does that mean it's enough? Well, that's where you have to evaluate the control to do a gap analysis to see if there is a need to supplement it, right? But first, you need to identify existing controls. Doing so allows you to save a money budget. Doing so allows you to know if you actually only need to supplement a control, not necessarily reinvent it. Let me give a quick example. Um, you're a network engineer and your organization just got a brand new firewall, maybe, right? A hardware firewall. Finish setting it up and whatever, and access to it. And you figured, like, this is the main firewall. I would like some sort of a multi-factor authentication before being able to administer it. You enable access via the web, uh, like the GUI, and then kind of disable the command line and all of that. So access is only via the GUI, and you put authentication in place. No, you realize there is no authentication by default, and you absolutely would like to put a multi-factor authenticator in place. If you then check to see if it comes with some form of, at least the first step, being able to set up a username and password first, and you go ahead and maybe subscribe to Okta, for example, that allows you to now set up username, password, and then send you a multi-factor authenticator. Now, probably you are spending more than you need because it could be but the device in itself by default, or rather comes pre-configured with some form of username and password. And the next thing you just need to add is maybe just the second multi-factor authenticator side of things, maybe using Authy or whatever. And you just feel to look into the existing controls. Now you find yourself spending more than you need to. That in itself is a risk. All right. So you identify, and then you begin to identify what vulnerabilities exist. Get into identifying what are the consequences. Consequences, the same as impact, right? As we mentioned earlier. Put all of those together and you do a risk estimation. Now, all of these involve what? One thing is information. We are gathering information, identifying asset, threats, controls, all of these. You will document them, but they are information. So, especially around those vulnerabilities, how do you gather such information? Well, we do have processes. You can use the historical method that involves looking at what happened to similar things before. As I mentioned with the firewall, maybe look into what are some historical um, things that relate with the firewall. Have there been some history of those devices getting hacked? How did they get hacked? Did you close that gap that resulted into that? Those are all methods of gathering information. Like that's one method of gathering information, right? Historical approach. Systematic. This could be using an expert opinion. That's a systematic approach. It could be actually identifying a single point of failure. It could be interviewing employees or folks who are familiar with such devices, or even using the example, the firewall. And then we also have that inductive theoretical analysis, right? Just looking at it on a general scheme of things of like, could be new technology or a process, identifying new points of attack, using tests. It could be a pen test. All of those are part of like that inductive analysis. And once you gather all of those, what's next? You have to classify it. Now, there's a need to classify risk because it allows you once it allows you to rank the risk, and then you begin to determine how do you respond to it. And we'll deep dive into risk classification when we get to assessment. But like from the ISACA approach, we have like COVID-5 for risk. It helps with risk classification. We have the COSO side of things, ISO, including with like NIST, we have the 800-39 that set the tone for like 800-60 around ranking a risk as low, moderate, or high. If you're on the DoD side of things, IL-2, IL-4, IL-5, and IL-6, and above, and all of those. Those are all part of risk classification, right? And actually, going back on the NIST side of things, for those of you that come with an NIST RMF, you know, once you do that early stage of preparation, if you're looking at dash 37 rep 2, once you do that early stage of preparation and whatever, you have to first do your categorization. You categorize your system. That's also part of risk classification. Determine if it's low, moderate, or high before you get to selecting the controls, which is that is more around the response side of it. Okay, all of this. So we identify a risk. That it. Well, before we get to assessment, we did mention that there will be a likelihood. We have to look into like we identify vulnerability. We have to look at is there a likelihood and a threat as well as the impact. But coming up with that is basically what we call the risk scenario. A risk scenario is basically thinking of the risk happening, the outcome of it as well. You hear of things like tabletop exercise, all of those, they are part of like risk scenarios. And there are certain components that must be in place before we basically do a risk scenario. One is an actor. We be it fictional or whatever, but we have to have like an actor. Is that an actor will be a hacker, right? Is that an internal actor? Is it an external? Internal actor could be a disgruntled employee. External could be an hacker. A threat. What is the intent of that actor, right? Could be malicious, could be accidental. So accidental could be an employee. Maybe an employee, the new hire, right? Good intentions, but just a mistake, accidental. If controls are not in place, they might push something into prod and everything will come down. Well, yeah, they should not be able to do that without some form of a PR, right? A push request or whatever. It could be an error, a failure. It could be nature in itself, and nature is also an actor. Events. Is it what kind of event will happen? Disclosure, interruption, right? An example of interruption when a ransomware attack is happening, that's a form of interruption, right? When data is stolen and spilled, no, that's a form of disclosure. Integrity, impacting integrity or changing a web page, that's a form of modification. Stealing billions of dollars from. No, did any one of you ever heard of like the Bangladesh hack that happened a couple of years ago? I
Is
think they hacked.
is is that where they waited for the weekend so they had 3 or 4 days for it to clear?
Yeah, the Bangladesh one.
Yes.
Can't remember the full details, but I know they wanted to steal around $1 billion or so, and they got away with like 100 and something, but only is it 80 was recovered? So it could be the one. I can't remember the main details, but I know that there was some form of a theft that happened.
Was that the issue with the SWIFT, International Money Transfer Protocol?
Yes, they definitely leverage SWIFT,
SWIFT,
to
right?
do that. Yes, yes, because Bangladesh kind of tried to digitize their central bank processes. Yeah, that was part of it. Yep. So that's a form of theft, right? And then we do have the nuisance, right? The full destruction. Yeah, that's also a form of an event that could happen. But then asset and resources. Just because there is an actor, a threat, and a possibility of an event, is there the skill to do that? Maybe not. And I will give you a classic example around that those resources. There is no secure encryption algorithm per se. Every single encryption algorithm that we have, including one ways, are able to be broken. The only reason why they are not broken is because the time it will take to break them. So let's use AES 256 and symmetric algorithm, for example. The only reason is because our processors, the processors that we have today, it will take them forever to break that, right? We don't have the resources in place to break that. However, the minute we do, then it becomes a risk. And that's why you keep hearing folks talking about as soon as quantum computing is commercialized, then a lot of these encryption algorithms will become irrelevant. There is a need for newer algorithms that are way ahead of at least quantum's capabilities, right? So don't feel overly safe with your encryption keys that, yep, I do see my HTTPS and there is no way this can be broken. Absolutely not. The only reason why it's not broken is just because the time it will take this devices we have, at least on the commercial side, will take a while. Um, so yeah, you could have an actor threat event, but if there is no resources for that to be exploited, then probably one could say it's okay. It depends on where it is, right? If they're willing to make that call. Process, applications, infrastructure, and all of those. What next? Timing. So using the encryption thing I mentioned earlier, if today you have an i7 machine, right, and you decided to implement AES 256, you have a thumb drive here. I will take a step back. So you have your little bitcoins, put them in a thumb drive, like put the key, uh, your private key and the thumb drive to your wallet, and you decided to, just encrypt it and put it in a safe deposit box. And the encryption keys to those to the thumb drive, maybe you use AES 256 to encrypt. And the encryption key to that thumb drive, decided you have this mastermind, so you just memorize it. Probably your brain is not the safest place, but let's keep it at that. Or maybe you went and wrote it under a stone and just went somewhere else and buried it. But anyway, skipping how you manage the keys itself, the thumb drive, you feel like, okay, this is absolutely secured. Yeah, it is to a certain extent. And we'll talk about how time plays a factor. If a system that has an i7 processor, maybe, I don't know, 32 gigs of RAM, whatever, it will take that system 200 years to crack that encryption on the USB thumb drive. And on your side, you're like, you know what? I'm just gonna live for the next 80 years. I don't care. At that point, the thumb drive is completely irrelevant. Or I'm just gonna come back 2 years from now to pick it up. Then there is that assurance and comfort level of knowing, like, you know what? Let a computer just be running it. It's gonna take 200 years before it gets cracked. That's fine. However, if the timing is 2 days, I assure you, you're not gonna do that. You are not going to allow the thumb drive be encrypted, knowing that there is a device out there that will be able to break it in 2 days, unless you are going to respond to it with lesser than 2 days. So that's around the time issue, right? Then ultimately you begin to realize, the security is also, sometimes dependent on how long it will take for it to be broken, including your front door in your house. If you have a very small lock, you might be comfortable with it knowing that it will take someone who knows how to pick locks 2 days to pick it. And there's no way you will be away from home for more than 2 days. So every day you're gonna come back home and yeah, that's fine. I don't need to upgrade it. But now you're gonna travel for a month. You might think like, let me put maybe an electronic version. But then probably the electronic version, that its battery is gonna run out in 3 months. Well, and if the battery runs out, it's going to automatically unlock. Well, if you know you're going to be away for more than a year, you will probably look for another alternative. So all of those are time-related stuff, eventually. And we factor all of those prior to making and coming up with an IT risk scenario. Okay. And that's it. Accountability, ownership, and responsibility. I think we have already touched on this, truly. Like every single risk, there has to be some form of ownership to either respond to the risk, be it accept, deny, mitigate, transfer, or all of those. There has to be an individual who owns that risk. And by ownership here, we're talking about who drives and the decision making from a response perspective, right? And there has to be accountability. The person or organization or whatever it is, there has to be someone ensuring that the risk in itself is owned and managed. And then we also have the responsibility, someone who is the hands-on, right? Responsible for making sure the risk is managed, including the compliance team, including the person that is going to log into the dashboard every single day to see how many people try to log into this bank, how many people try to change their, profile, how many people logged into the organization database at 1 a.m. All of those, right? The person responsible for documenting in itself, typing in the keyboard. That's that responsibility happens middle management and below the analyst level, right? All of those are responsible. But then we have this saying that everybody's responsible for security. It is true because risk is everybody's responsibility. Not all of the risk, but every single individual within an organization has form of risk that they should be responsible for, or that they are responsible for, even if it's as small as making sure that the door is locked behind them once they go through it. That's a responsibility, and that's them handling the risk. Because if they don't lock the door, then probably something else will come in. Or it could be by shutting off their computer at night, because if they don't do it. So everybody does have some form of a risk. And one of the reasons why we tend to say security is everybody's responsibility, technically it's not security, because security has always been synonymous with like protection and defense and all of that. But it's all around the CISO's role, the chief information, not chief cyber. The chief information security officer's role to protect information, well, information is everywhere within any single institution. Whether you're in accounting, you're dealing with information, or you're in legal department, you're dealing with information. It doesn't matter. Including the janitor. They do need information to know what time to come in and what time to go out. When is the closing time? That's information. Could be literally the most, maybe I've seen a lot of movies, but knowing what time all the employees are gone and what time is the janitor cleaning and what time they finish cleaning could be a vital information. So who knows? Yeah, I think I've probably watched a lot of crime movies. So yeah, going into then the risk register. That's around documentation, and we'll talk in depth in the next slide on this, which is very important. And I will always ask about this. When I used to give a quiz in this class related to these discussions, I usually emphasize a lot on this, which is documentation, documentation, documentation. So these are just a couple, not all of them, but with everything, there is a need to document risk. With everything risk, be it identification, assessment, and whatever, including signed signatures, right? If you identify a risk and you don't document it, then it's all in your head. Probably get hit by a bus. If it's not a risk. Earlier I mentioned a network engineer. You have a new firewall. You set a username and a password. If you don't document it, and documentation doesn't have to be the, please don't do it in a, what do you call it? My goodness, well, I can't even remember. I think I'm getting sleepy or something. When documenting it this. So whether you're using some form of a password manager or whatever it is, that's all form of documentation if you're using that for username and password. So you're the network engineer, set up a new device, set the admin password, change that admin password from, I don't know, admin 123 that it was default by the organization. And you change that router default IP from 192.168.1.1 to like your private IP, internal IP to like 10.10.10 or something like that. All of those, they need to be documented so that if you get out and get hit by the bus, at least the next person will continue from where you stop. If you don't do that, that's a risk. So as a CISO, it is important to actually not only emphasize, but put it as part of the risk management process to document within risk registers. In the government, at least from ATO standpoint, risk registers are sometimes called ATO POAMs, right? That's what you keep saying all the time that is getting reviewed. Want to know a little bit about POAM? Go and read GAO's report. There is an agency that I'm not going to call their name. I always crack that joke, but I think they always have so many findings within the government that it's just laughable. Every single year, GAO does the General Audit Office, I believe. They assess them on the POAM findings are a lot. But yeah. So what do you document from a risk standpoint? Well, first and foremost, let's talk about risk ID. It is very important to uniquely identify risk, meaning it needs to have just like a name, right? But it should be uniquely identified. You can use some form of unique identifier. That's why we have like CVE IDs, right? At least a description. None of this is written in stone, and these are not the requirements. Every single organizations and situation differs, right? So these are just things at a high level that we kind of put together. Maybe the risk ID, describe what the risk is, who owns the risk. Is there a scenario? Hardly would you see that in a risk register, but is there any of that? What's the risk category, right? That's part of that classification. Is it a high, low, moderate? Is it 10, 9, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 being like, whoa, this is the first thing for us to address. What's the impact? So if that risk were to be exploited, what will happen, right? As well as if that is unaddressed in itself, what does it mean to the organization? Risk response types. How are we responding to it? Are we transferring this risk? Are we accepting it? Are we, mitigating it? Are we even completely moving away? Like, now we don't want to deal with this. So, people say California is gonna save. I'm starting my, let me see, what am I gonna start? I don't know what kind of company I'm gonna start. Hey, I'm gonna start some form of maybe oxygen company, because I know everybody wants to move to Mars probably, and then I'm gonna start transporting it over there. So I'm thinking I'll be in existence for the next 500 years, and I don't want to just set base in Cali. So I'm gonna run away from whatever risk exists there and move to Indiana. Who knows? I don't know. Why did I say Indiana? Maybe because I went to school there, and there's so much corn in Indiana that I don't like corn. All right. Risk owner. We mentioned that is. Oh, sorry. Response owner. Who is responding to the risk and who owns responding to the risk. Again, these are all around down. Response could be from accountability, or it could even be from the responsibility, right? And in many instances, we have seen it where, so I think it's getting better now because we are continuously evolving. So there's delineation, but the CISO and the CIO used to fight. So the the CTO, sorry, the Chief Technology Officer that owns the technology, and then you have the Chief Information Officer, and then you have the Chief Information Security Officer. Before it used to be everybody would be either under the CTO or the CIO. The CISO is always under them, but slowly CISO is getting their own, like CISOs are getting their own seat in the room, right? Dedicated room. And we've even started seeing it. I'm not joking, like just organization level. If you look at it even within US Gov, I think at some point we have, is it like the Chief Information Security Officer for the nation or something like that? And we've been having like cybersecurity advisors having a sit on as advisors to the president, right? Before it could just be some form of advisor from a technology standpoint. So the role is getting there, but then sometimes you find the role becomes more like a traffic cop where they take care and direct it. They don't necessarily own it, right? Because the technology is probably owned by the CTO, including the implementation of the technology. Information is probably like the data that is housed within the CTO's organization is probably owned by the CIO. However, the CISO is the one who police it. So all of those you find probably the CISO is responsible for the risk register in itself as a whole, but they are not necessarily responsible for responding to the risk because the risk is a technology related risk that the CTO's office will have to implement. So all of those, and then the role starts becoming much more of dealing with people than dealing with the technical work in itself, right? Yeah, that's a tricky one, but we are seeing it happen, and I believe some of you are literally living it right now. The response description. The last thing we have is around risk awareness. All of this should be communicated, right? You see, so communication is important to security professionals, not just from a boardroom and getting a budget perspective, but from bringing everybody on board to ensure everyone understand the importance of it. So we have to be it from a training perspective. Things are changing. Before you can make it like, whoa, there's these consequences. Maybe now you just have to find a way to, from that empathy side. Or maybe, I don't know. I guess there is a need for a CISO to have some form of strategic communication skills, right? To find effective way to communicate risk. And also to the enterprise, right? How the organization recognize such risk as well as manages the risk. And that's pretty much it for today. And at a high level, these are just a couple of things we discussed, right? Risk practitioner, what they must ensure they're able to do to identify a risk, and the importance of understanding business goals and objectives. We cannot downplay this. It doesn't matter. And by organization doesn't mean for profit, doesn't mean a private institution. The government in itself is an organization. A country in itself is an organization. Basically, any collection of entities that agree to do certain things in itself could be an organization. A society could be an organization. Right. So if you're a CISO of a certain society, then probably you should be conversant on what that society is trying to achieve, as well as their goals, and align with that. Or at least the risk that needs to be identified should be from that perspective. I'll keep saying this. A typical hospital probably will not have the same type of risk that the intelligence committee will have, and the intelligence committee will not have a similar risk as Marymount University. So if your experience is being the CISO for Marymount, and today you find yourself in the health sector, probably it's to align things from a health perspective, not necessarily from educational. So all of these is understanding the business, right? Documentation, creating a risk register. So this brings us to the end of today's lecture. And what we're gonna do is probably take 15-minute break and then come back and spend another 20 minutes on that discussion from a governance perspective. And please, I will say, try to engage in it. I have read a lot of the discussions. It's quite entertaining. Any question before we take a break?
No.
Dr. Waziri, can
Yeah.
you pop up the risk identification slide? I wanted to see something. I thought I might have missed something.
So the risk identification slide, like the entire slide is online. You can download it on Canvas, I believe.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to see something on it. I thought,
This is the scenario. All right, let's see it. By the way, Fortune, we can pause the recording because we have reached the end of the class. So this slide, is that the one you're talking about?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. No, I was looking at the COVID.
Mm.
Yeah. Because we use COVID-19 a lot and map that with a lot of different regulations now.